So, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to welcome here Stanley Ambrose from the University of Illinois, United States. Stan is professor of anthropology, but his scope is, I would say, enormous. He does human evolution, human ecology, human diet, isotopic geochemistry, and paleoecology, and works all over the world, but I think mostly in Africa. Of course, Africa is cradle of humankind, so this is not surprising. I had a great opportunity and honor to co-author one article this year in Antiquity with Stan. This article is led by Eladia and Lenka Varazinovic. And I think the topic of today is somehow related to this, to the content of this article. So, Stan, thank you for coming, and the audience is yours.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all of you for coming. Try to pick up the side. And so this is big red pointer. So Darwin had a secret for us. Actually, it was no big secret. He wrote about how we stood up on two legs to carry weapons and defend ourselves with our core built-in weapons, our teeth. And he proposed the theory that still drives paleoanthropology, the study of human evolution today. And it was taken a bit further, quite a bit further, by Raymond Dart when he discovered among the broken bones in cave deposits in South Africa, Australopithecus africanus, who might be one of our earliest ape-men ancestors. Recognized that he walked on two legs, and Darwin knew that walking on two legs was an important definition of what it means to be human. And he interpreted all of the bone fragments as tools and weapons. And so he developed this idea of what we call the osteodonto-keratic, horn, tooth, and bone culture or technology. And he talked about, it was quite influential. This is a 2001 The Space Odyssey. The first scene, it actually spans 2 days, and it takes up a significant amount of the movie, amount of time in the movie. And at the end of it, this bone throws it in the air and it spins around and around, and it becomes the space station in 2001. Launched on March 1st, 2001. And I published a paper where I closed with that image on that date in 2001. It was published in the journal Science. It was called Paleolithic Technology and Human Evolution. So that was a lucky coincidence. And I misquoted the motto for the British Air Force, which I misremembered from Colin Renfrew, who founded the MacDonald Institute for Archaeology at Cambridge. I said, ex terra ad astra. It's actually per ardua ad astra, from difficulty to the stars. And but I haven't talked to Colin about that. So the killer ape theory is what I want to talk about. I'm actually going to talk about some really big, long-standing questions and the way our thoughts have been molded by these ideas. Back to Darwin's time, nature red in tooth and claw, and other things. So the killer ape theory, which was developed in the 1920s, is a running theme right up through 2001 Space Odyssey and beyond. Still active debate. And the most strongly worded killer ape hypothesis paper was published in 1953, the year I was born. They were carnivorous, predatory, cannibalistic, used bones, bone clubs, split bones, and pig tusks. There's daggers. There's a
what is the time frame of this transition? When?
About 2.5 million years ago, 3.5 million years ago. That's the age of the sites that were being found. So the transition from walking on 4 legs like a gorilla or a chimpanzee, they walk on their knuckles too, that's been an open question. And the answer seems to be somewhere around 6 million. And that means for 3 million years, there's no evidence of tool use. So decoupling the tool use from standing up was an important thing. At least tools that we can identify, like stone tools or fossil bones. The first evidence of stone tools is 3.3 million years ago. But our ancestors were walking around on 2 legs on the savannah, so they could see over the tall grass, according to Darwin, and carrying weapons. That part of the theory fell apart because there was no connection that we have evidence for the linkage of standing up and advanced tool use. And now we know that chimpanzees, in particular, don't have to walk on 2 legs to use tools. So that kind of fell apart. They slaked their thirst with hot blood from writhing flesh. Really dramatic. And he inspired Robert Ardrey, who had done anthropology at the University of Chicago and then became a playwright, famous playwright. And he went back to paleoanthropology and met Raymond Dart and was so inspired by him that he wrote several books emphasizing and elaborating on the idea that we are killer apes by our heritage. And during the time of the world wars in the last century, this was quite well received, but there was also always an antithetical debate to that. And the debate still goes on. And this is what I want to talk about today. And put it in the context of the work of Dr. Sakova and Baratz and today that feel very fortunate to be able to participate in because it's opened up my horizons in a way that I haven't considered before. So we have arguments for violent instincts of humans, and it's supported by chimpanzee behavioral studies. There are killer apes, quite traumatic, but it's contradicted by the other chimpanzee, the bonobo, called the pygmy chimpanzee, but they actually are as tall as regular chimpanzees, but they're completely different. And they were only systematically studied starting in the 1980s, a century after Darwin sat in the zoo in England and watched the chimpanzees in the zoo then. They're the hippie chimpanzees. And they do stand up quite straight. If you ever get to see them in a zoo, they're arresting. They look you in the eye. They stand on 2 legs, and you feel like you're looking in a mirror, which you don't feel the same way when you look at a chimpanzee. And that may actually be intended to do that. So there are 2 of the books that Robert Ardrey wrote. The first one was Africagenesis, The Animal Origins and Nature of Man, very atavistic. And then The Hunting Hypothesis. books about the nature of man. He wrote 4 books in total. So here we have, this is a lone chimpanzee, but they go out in parties directly to their territorial boundaries in the morning sometimes. After a bout of nervous grooming, almost like they're a little rally in the locker room before they go out onto the field. And then they get very quiet and they listen for a lone chimpanzee. And if it's a pre-reproductive female, they welcome her in, but if it's a female with a baby, they can actually kill even females. I was shocked to hear this. But they do this all the time. And the bonobo, completely the opposite. Unlike the chimpanzee, males, which have a lot of testosterone, and testosterone is associated with a deep voice, a long pace, high aggression. The bonobo, males and females have equal testosterone. They are less different in their body sizes, and the females are actually dominant. All the males are lower ranked than the females. They have lots of intergroup meetings that are peaceful. And they can even have up to 70 or 80% overlap in their territories. So the idea of Archer's book called The Territorial Imperative, which was another book that Robert Archer wrote, seems to fall apart. Everything fell apart with the bonobo because we had 2 chimpanzee species that were equally closely related to us. Are we atavistically killer apes, or are we atavistically, have we inherited our nature from the hippie chimpanzees? Maybe in the Czech Republic more than other places.
Why?
Why?
You know this.
Why? Well, when I was in college, I was the era of the Vietnam War protests, and my apartment when I was in college was decorated with posters from the Prague Spring by Czech artists. And so it was around me on the walls every day. And so somehow it all kind of seeped into me at a time when I was also, well, I still am. One of the greatest influences on my life is Frank Zappa, who was very close. Sounds like there's a question. Or maybe I'm not talking loud enough.
I don't know. Let's mute everyone.
I hope I'm talking loud enough. So if you can't hear me, please let me know. So Richard Wrangham, professor at Harvard, was writing in the this century about demonic males based upon the common chimpanzee model. And the antithesis to the Steven Pinker, who's also at Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 2 kilometers away. And the blank slate is the idea that we are not controlled by our instincts and our inheritance. We are a blank slate at birth. And he's very positive about this view of life. The current events always seem to make people say, well, I don't know. There are lots of demonic things going on now. For example, Israel and the Palestinians. Okay.
Just by the way, we invite Steven Pinker will be here in the Prague Science in Castle series probably next year. So look forward to.
Steven has been a big influence on my blog as well. He recommended a book to me called Non-Zero. Non-zero from some transactional, non-transactional interaction mode of a way of life. So Donald Trump is the lived in transactional. Everything is a one-on-one game, and no building of trust from one to the next. He treats the world like he doesn't owe them anything beyond that immediate transaction. It's right. And so I read that book and I was really influenced by it. So I have to thank Steven Pinker for that. The debate goes on. So, and the influence on popular culture continues as well. Natural born killers. And this all starts most prominently with Raymond Dart. It's now almost a century ago. Okay, and this is the territorial imperative. I'm really interested, and I've been since I was in graduate school, the idea of under what conditions do we find territorial defensive behavior among hunter-gatherers, and under what conditions, what are the underlying factors that lead to large-scale intergroup cooperation. It's like asking the question of what I call the troop-tribe transition, because the chimpanzees act like a typical primate troop. They go to their boundaries, they display, they defend, sometimes violently. But the bonobo, when they meet another group, it's party time. Quite literally. So the questions that are raised by all this is how much is cooperation hardwired or aggression hardwired? To what extent can it be contingent? What are the biological aspects of it? So there's a whole field called behavioral neuroendocrinology, hormones and behavior. There are journals of that name. And it's very important research because what we think is free will is manipulatable by a little nasal spray with testosterone, making you more aggressive, short-circuiting your ability to think through and put a hold on your impulses. In the experimental situations, even where you've asked people how they would respond under this set of experimental conditions in a two-person interaction. And the oxytocin, which does the opposite, increases trust, generosity, reciprocity, relaxes, and very interestingly, it allows even autistic people to hold gaze with you in the eye. And I think looking you in the eye is very important for assessing honesty, trustworthiness, and threats. And there's some studies that actually show that people who've had traumatic upbringings actually increase their testosterone. They're looking people in the eyes, especially young women, and the men are misinterpreting this. They're trying to assess trust, and then that they're making eyes at them. It's very interesting.
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Is the aggression related to high testosterone?
Oh, yeah.
More related rather to like of the other hormones like oxytocin?
Oxytocin is the antidote to testosterone.
Yeah.
Serotonin also plays a role. So Prozac is called a selective serotonin uptake inhibitor, an SSRI. The serotonin is a calming hormone as well. And the drugs that work on some people to calm them down, Prozac and the other SSRIs, actually keep the serotonin in your synapses between your neurons there longer, reduces the nervousness, obsessive compulsive behavior. The fear center in our brain is a little almond-shaped pair of organs called the amygdala, And amygdala is an almond-shaped thing. And it has a lot of receptors for different kinds of hormones. And it's a complicated chain. And there are other of genetic adaptations, most of which have two different varieties of genes. We call them alleles. They operate in different ways, and they also precondition things like whether you will or not be, whether you will respond to the Prozac. And one genetic variant, those people, Prozac doesn't work on. So it's very interesting. So I
was just asking because there are some doctors who like promote increasing your level of testosterone as something healthy for man. So I was just wondering if it's like possible to have high testosterone and still be peaceful, you know, be ambitious, be a healthy man, but also be peaceful being.
You need a strong frontal lobe.
Yeah.
With strong controls on your impulses to begin with. Yeah. One of the interesting things about testosterone is it has a lot of effects, like for building muscle. If you feed testosterone to a young boy who's developmentally a little bit behind his classmates and he's getting beaten up in the schoolyard, and the parents say, we have to get him to bulk up. The whole lower face extends. Females typically have smaller jaws, and the voice gets deeper as the larynx descends. And in the brain, there's a supercharged version of testosterone called dihydrotestosterone. When it's converted to that into the brain, and you have too much of it, or you're too susceptible, given your genetic variants, you can become the Incredible Hulk, turn green, your muscle burst out of your clothes, and you start throwing cars. And there are a variety of pathways to increasing testosterone that involve our microbiome, turns out. If you have the wrong microbes, just learned this from a microbiome group that I'm part of. There are two pathways to increasing the testosterone, and I call these the Incredible Hulk microbes. The microbes are making the testosterone blocking. They're removing the inhibitors of the testosterone. It's quite amazing. So some of you may recognize the artist.
Everybody.
I just bought this book yesterday. The guy. I love Florian. So here we have troop-like defensive behavior, and they look like modern humans like us. I would have had a dog instead of a boar in the picture. And then there's the tribe-like behavior. So under what circumstances, this is what's driven most of my career, the evolution of cooperation. Under what circumstances will we have cooperation, peace, negotiations, egalitarian interactions, collaborations versus just plain territorial defense? No dogs. I think dogs are important, but that's another talk. So let's go to the Nile. And the Nile Valley is very interesting. Right here at the Sudan, Ethiopia border, there, yes, right there, is a burial cemetery just out of the Aswan Dam, south, or is it underwater now?
Underwater.
Ooh, I'd love to see more done there. When they discovered the site, they thought, Tony Marks said, they went back to camp and said, we discovered a Neanderthal graveyard. Now, there are no Neanderthals in Africa, but these were very robust, strongly built people with big faces. As if, like the clinical studies show, what happens to humans during development and other animals actually, when they're given too much testosterone. There's a little hint of something there that needs to be followed up on. They found 63 individuals. Many of them had traces of violence or trauma and other lesions. There were artifacts embedded inside the skull, rattling around that were interpreted as arrow points. Some skeletons had arrows heads, stone arrowheads that penetrated the bone, and the bone had healed over, and you can only see them in x-rays. Or you see a little bit of stone sticking out of that, and then you do the x-ray and you see what it is. These pencils are pointing to different artifacts that would have been embedded in the body cavity. We know the archaeological culture, the style of artifacts, belongs to one defined culture called the Qadan, Qadan, but we don't know if they made it or they were the recipients of the stone tools. Because up and down the Nile at this time, there are many different stone tool cultures, stylistically different. There was a crowded place on this part of the Nile Valley. All of this is curated at the British Museum now, although it was a joint Polish and American, but it actually started with a solely American expedition from Columbia University. Professor Fred Windorf was at the Southern Methodist University in Texas, and he worked with, I forgot his name.
Romuald usually.
Yeah, Romuald Still in Poland. For many, many, many years, but material all ended up in the British Museum. And there's a wonderful website for this. Okay.
So the date of this is?
The date is very controversial. And we're still working on trying to resolve the controversies. It's been claimed to be as old as 18,300 years. And many of the dates are actually only 9,000, but we're going with about 12,000 until we get some new dating samples that we can date with modern techniques. And we're looking forward to making progress on that in December with Isabelle Crevecoeur, who's a fundamental part of this project. But here are just some examples of the injuries. Let's see, that's on the ulna. Those are fresh chop marks. These are, that's the forearm. These are broken forearms that were healed. When you have a fracture in the middle of the forearm, it's called a parry fracture. So when you're engaging in battle and somebody is about to hit you with a club and you go, no, don't hit me, and they hit you, that's where the break occurs. So this is one example. This is a particularly disturbing one for me because it's on the inside of the thigh where the femoral artery is. It's the largest artery outside of your heart. It's outside of your central body cavity, and you can bleed to death in a few minutes. So chalk marks on the inside of the femur, quite not the best way to go. And so the unhealed wounds tell us that they were dying at high rates. And this reflects chronic debilitating warfare. Let's say 12,000 years ago, maybe 13. But the dates are still not completely satisfactory. And they were all dated in the 1970s before we had modern radiocarbon technology. So we're trying again if we can get the samples.
And the dating matters very much here because if you say 12, 13,000, so it's the younger grass, it's far on the younger grass, which would be very different notion to define.
But if I may add here, the dating is 18,000 to 13,000, and it is based on one date obtained on collagen in 1970s. But collagen is actually does not preserve in this region, and they try to extract further collagen from the same individual, other individuals, and it's zero. So it's actually not known what was dated, but still this date holds as the date of that burial ground. Then they were apartheid dates, and now that actually gave the 9,000 BP, 11,000 BP, but they are considered as minimum ages. And as Stanley is well known for improved methods of pretreatment of samples, we are now trying to get new samples from Sahaba actually to get better dating, more reliable dating. Yeah.
So are you going, in principle, are you going for biophosphide dating now?
Choose enamel appetite, not bone. Curiously, the whole project, which Antoine Zazo, who wrote a short paper about how the 18,300-year-old date was impossible because the collagen doesn't exist throughout that part of the Sahara. Collagen is the protein in your bones and your skin and your cartilage, and it melts if you're making a good rich soup broth at about 69 degrees, 67 degrees Celsius. And the warmer the burial environment is, the faster this will melt. So all of the collagen that we would like to date, the bone protein, probably melted away thousands of years ago. You can get collagen out of mummified specimens that are from the late dynastic period to the last 2 or 3 centuries, but not before, because it's all just melted away. This is a problem in every hot, wet, or every hot, dry environment. There's plenty of collagen in Neanderthals. They live at high latitudes. They don't live in Africa. So this was published in 2021, and even though Antoine Zazo here criticized that 18,300-year-old date, it's in the abstract for this paper in the Nature journal called Scientific Reports, as if it's valid. And this really is what precipitated the new round of hunting down the original dating report, which was never actually fully described. Others were, that were tried to have been dated at the same time, and they said, nothing to date. We got a bunch of stuff out of one of these skeletons, and here's the date, and here's how it's calibrated. Unfortunately, that's the one that we're trying to get tooth enamel from to get a very valid date. Okay, so the perifractures. Let's move down to the Charles University expedition. We published this paper in August. I'm not sure if it even has page numbers yet, but it's available online. And some of the themes, like Raymond Dart's killer ape, we introduced at the beginning of the paper, but it's mainly a murder mystery. It's a forensic case, cold case of a murder on the Nile Valley. It's about 80 kilometers north of Khartoum on the 6th cataract. So Jebel Sahaba is here. Maybe I should use the pointer. And there are other sites that have abundant evidence for violence. Petra mentioned what's called the Younger Dryas. This is the end of the Ice Age in northern Africa, I suppose right down to Tanzania. Began to get warm and humid and high rainfall, more reliable resources. The Sahara was becoming somewhat green, starting 14,700 years ago, 14,800 years ago. Suddenly at 13,000, the whole world went dry for 1,000 years. And then it returned to an even wetter, longer, consistently humid period with very rich resources. Now, The theory that I've been working with that goes back to the 1930s about human territoriality is that where there are high population densities of peoples living in close proximity, they will defend their territories because they have territories that can be small and the perimeter is small enough to defend, and there's lots of resources to defend. In the dry ice age, there were likely vast ranges that had no food resources and nothing to defend. And it would be better if you shared information about where resources were with your neighbors. This is the ecological contingency theory, and it looks like modern humans, but not Neanderthals. We're able to make this switch back and forth from information sharing, territory sharing, to territoriality. So the territoriality model works quite nicely for Jebel Sahaba and Wadi Halfa on the other side of the river, where there's only slightly less evidence for violence. But down here, where there are fishing, hunting and gathering, fishing villages of hunter-gatherers, many very rich archaeological materials, we don't see the evidence for violence. And this has been the big question for me in this project from my long-term interest. Why, when I expected there to be lots of violence, and I had assumed that the skeletons that were being recovered, many of them would show evidence of violence. But my theoretical bias was so strong, I didn't even bother to look to see if the actual evidence for it was there. But Isabelle Crecoeur, the skeletal biologist with Petra, Petra, you in here?
She's not.
She's not. Oh, we're not seeing. This is a very important player because that's her, the first author on this paper. Petra Buchner Abukova. Okay. Okay, so Jebel Sabaloka, the mountain range, the Nile Valley cuts right through the middle of it. It's an unusual geological formation with an interesting geochemistry that may help us figure out some aspects of where people were coming from. This is the site, I think, Fox Hill. That's whoops, and I think go back. Yeah. And one of Lenga and Lada's excavation. I'm not sure if this is the one with the key burials. So burial 14. And that's the one in gray, right? Okay. I have another image of it here. There's burial 14, among many burials there. It turned out to be very interesting. This is the shoulder blade with some ribs cemented to it. And in between the ribs and the inside of the shoulder blade was this piece of bone that is burned, and it's got moderately sharp point broken off inside between the ribs and the scapula, and it poked from the inside out a hole, just like Raymond Dart with his glove. And when I read the manuscript, that was the first thing I thought of was this was a killer ape weapon from 2.5 to 3 million years ago. Okay, so there's another image. That's the shoulder blade. This is the bone pushed out from the inside, and a bit of a chip there. So this is what we call a perimortem injury. So this is death on the Nile. And to put this in the comparative perspective, those that occur before this period called the Younger Dryas, the Arid period, we have a total of approximately 200 skeletons. Well, this count is 49, 42, and 19. That's only about 120, but that's enough of a sample of skeletons. 42% had evidence of violence, perimortem trauma on average, healed or unhealed trauma, healed trauma, trauma at the time of death. And the early Holocene period after this dry period, when it was even more crowded and we would expect more violence and competition, 8.5% healed or unhealed. So that's a total. That's a dramatic difference. And it completely blew away my lifetime, my intellectual lifetime since I was a graduate student. Conception, it completely broke my rules. So I had to rethink everything. And I would discuss this in my history of archaeological theory as an example of how my theoretical biases were making me blind, or not even bothering to look. Because I just assumed so strongly that the world worked that way. You just have to look. So I started looking around and asking questions. At the time, Richard Wrangham and others were writing about warfare and violence. And one of the things that they cited was this paper by Gail Kang, where she compared hunter-gatherers, she did a cross-cultural study of the incidents of warfare and looked at post-marital residence patterns, whether women were moving to the husband's family group at marriage, or whether the men were moving in. And one of her conclusions was that where there is what we call matrilocal PMR, post-marital residence, non-patrilocal societies are typified by peace between internal social units. This is why women should rule the world. Patrilocal PMR, fraternal interest groups are power groups of related males. It's like the chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are patrilocal. The females migrate in, but they're at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. And chimpanzees forget where they came from. If a chimpanzee group splits into two, the brothers are now considered enemies. So even that level of kinship, kin recognition, does not override the power groups of related males. Okay, principal characteristics of fraternal interest groups include solidarity, within group cooperation, which seems to be amplified by oxytocin as well. The nervous grooming that they do, grooming, a good massage stimulates oxytocin, especially with some good music and maybe a glass of white wine. There are many ways of stimulating oxytocin, but it's a hormone that's associated with cooperation. There could be cooperation within the group, who's about to go out and do aggression between groups. So there's an interesting debate that's been going on for 12 years about, is oxytocin just one thing, but we have to actually look at the step back a little bit and say, yes, it enhances cooperation, whether it's cooperation within the group or cooperation between individuals over the extended landscape. So there could be oxytocin in both Borean's scenarios, but it's playing a different role there. So Gail, I don't want to miss anything. Well, that's the point that Gail made. And so I don't think she's expected it, because most of anthropology, social anthropology, comparative ethnology, has said that the ancestral condition for humans before colonial interference was patrilocal post-marital residence. It's the default. But there's plenty of post-marital residence. We don't know how far back these two alternatives go. And there's another alternative. It's called neolocal. And 33 societies surveyed, the dominant hunter-gatherer pattern they found was not patrilocal or matrilocal. It was going to a new group entirely, often where there was a brother or a sister. But if you have 10 couples, that's at least 10 communities that they have a network connections to, because each member of the pair has a connection to a different group. You just can't go off and attack any of those neighbors because they are, there are genetic relationships with all of them. And it's a great way of building a very densely woven, cross-interlocking network over a large region. So kinship, residence rules. And in most societies, this is coupled or carefully constructed by arranged marriages by the parents, who would like to have their children genetically diverse, even if they don't know anything about genetics, have the parents with different sets of genes from very great distances away. And this simple rule, which was Polly Wiesner we were talking about earlier, there she is. And Bernard Charpet wrote a book called Primeval Kinship. He went to study primates because he wanted to understand humans. Very important book. And he wrote the perspective on this in the journal Science in that issue, 11 March. This simple rule turns isolated communities and just add arranged marriages into a dense, rich, safe network for people to move around in without fear of being barred from any territory. And if there's an emergency, a drought, everybody can either go to their family or their spouse's family in another territory. It's a highly resilient system. Very important. So there are two kinds of post-marital residence that promote intergroup cooperation on a large scale, neolocal and matrilocal. The men don't care about their wives. In patrilocal, the men don't care much about where their wives come from. They have a coalition of brothers. And they're more independent. So this is also from actually this sort of a profile in the journal Science about Polly Wiesner, who studied in the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, the Bushman hunter-gatherers, and she discovered they had a very complicated and rich system of reciprocal gift exchange, extending up to 200 kilometers from the territories of the individuals. So this old woman at the time had 25 gift exchange partners. These are formal partnerships that babies inherit from their parents and then they develop new ones. And what Polly observed was that on average 45 gift partnerships were established, and the parents of the children who were getting to be of marriageable age were spending a lot of time visiting people at great distances, bringing gifts, and wearing as much as they could to show that these gifts were simple representations of their social network, their social capital, and that they are trustworthy individuals who are likely to be generous, allow you to come into their territory if you set up a little symbolic gift exchange partnership. So we read the voice of material culture, it's called. So when you see a big engagement ring with a very big diamond, you know that somebody loves that woman a lot. And it's the silent, it's the loud voice of the material culture. We can fake it, but they loaded themselves up, as she found, with all the ornaments that they could bear, and then they'd walk dozens to tens, hundreds of kilometers, and everybody knows who their gifted partners are, and they develop a reputation, and they don't have to say anything. She obviously had a good reputation, and she probably taught her children well. This increases the genetic diversity, increases the distance of trust in networks. Very important. And Paulie Wiesner actually proposed that the invention of mass production of ornaments like this was a signature of the beginning of arranged marriages. That's really interesting. So, arranged marriages are important. Let me just wrap this up with a few concluding thoughts here. So the Nile Valley had really high population densities both before and after this dry period. We don't know if they were the same population that came back or a different population that developed a post-marital residence pattern elsewhere, or even if they had a post-marital residence pattern. And one of the challenges for us now is to figure out quantitative ways of demonstrating. We can't use genetics yet. The DNA is destroyed along with the collagen. There may be geochemical methods. There are long-standing biological, anthropological measurements of the skeletons that suggest, but those are more, have a greater degree of uncertainty. So there are several ways of trying to get at reconstructing post-marital residence patterns, and we're working on one of them. I was wrong based on the theories. I'm very happy to be wrong because it raises new questions. Why is this an exception to the quote-unquote rule, which works quite well around the world? I have a paper published in 1990 where I reviewed all of this around the world. And so it raises a lot of questions. Was it a product of the peaceful period, the product of neo or matrilocal post-marital residence? Was the troop-to-tribe transition, as I call it, facilitated by gifts and cooperation? During the last ice age, when the environment was very risky, you needed to be able to count on your neighbors, and they needed to be able to count on you, because without that information, you could only work from memory. It's better to get up in the morning and read the newspaper, so to speak, and know what the opportunities are for that day or that week in this part of the world, and then go there. And you visit with people and they tell you what is happening in that part of the landscape, and everybody shares information. It's called the information sharing strategy. And it's reinforced in many cases by these gift-giving relationships. When did it happen? The archaeological evidence has to be extracted for this. As well as the genetic, I suppose, but genes don't preserve that well, especially in tropical Africa. Modern humans like us came out of Africa maybe 60, 50,000 years ago. And it looks like they came out with this cooperation system in place. There have been earlier rounds of Africa, but this is the one that succeeded all the way to Siberia, Eastern Asia, and then eventually even into the Americas. Other previous outs of Africa didn't get beyond the Mediterranean basin. Did Neanderthals make the transition? Genetic evidence suggests they were horribly interbred, as if they didn't have a system of arranged marriages, and as if they had strong territories that prevented inbreed, that would have prevented exchange of mates safely. Lots of cannibalism. And their genetic diversity is so low. There's so many half-sister, half-sibling marriages, matings in the DNA, and other incredible things. Every DNA sequence that's been analyzed where you can get the gene chromosomes from both parents show 1/5 the genetic diversity of the modern humans that were found on the edges of the initial expansion of people out of Africa. The genetic diversity is only 1/5. Even at the far fringes where there were few mates to choose from 45,000 years ago in Siberia, they have the genetic diversity of peoples who have arranged marriages. It's really striking. When you talk about the archaeological evidence as well. So the absence of warfare on the Nile Valley in this post-Younger Dryas, rich, wet period is called the African humid period. The whole Sahara was populated densely. Villages all the way across to Mauritania and down to the arid areas of the Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. The absence of warfare in the Nile suggests intergroup relationships are not predetermined by the territorial imperative. We are flexible, we're contingent, and it's not all simple ecology. So at the end of my career here, I've become a social anthropologist, and I'm interested in like Claude Lévi-Strauss and his elementary structures of kinship. Now, when he was writing this, he was writing with the undercurrent to everything he wrote, anti-eugenics and avoidance of inbreeding. John Steinbeck's novel, if you read all the way to the end of it, you discover it's about the blank slate, whether the central character in the story is whether his children are going to grow up to be like his brother, who is the actual father of the children, who is a violent man, or like him, who is a preacher and preached peace. The book ends long before the children grow up. But the undercurrent there is from the 1950s, 60s ideas of eugenics. Whether we are a blank slate or whether we are, we've inherited this killer ape line. So Stephen Picker, again, comes up with this book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence has Declined. And the immediate response was, but read the newspaper, listen to the radio. And it's just as true today, but he said there's a common criticism of evolutionary psychology, and that's what he is as well as a linguist. It dooms us to external strife, eternal strife. Why even bother to work towards peace if we're just bloody killer apes and violence is in our genes? Well, we can override what may have been in our genes, and we have an alternative model for the killer chimpanzee apes. And we have the same exact degree of genetic relatedness to both. So Pinker didn't address, I haven't read the book, so I don't know if he's taken up the bonobo evidence, but I have him to thank for some of the work. He has allowed me to formulate some of these thoughts, and I thank you all for coming. And really would enjoy some of your questions, comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and I think a lot of material to discuss here, and we have still really plenty of time, up to 1 hour of discussion. So take the opportunity, please, and from both sides, yeah, here.
Okay, I have an obvious question. There were like several points made about the genetic basis for peacefulness or aggression and something. But what do you think about the theory that it makes better sense to like tackle the question from the side of cultural evolution or memetics? Because in my opinion, war is a typical selfish cultural replicator because it doesn't need to be inherent, but when it invades the population, the idea, it is very difficult to eradicate. So even a very peaceful kind of primate would engage in warfare if it was very susceptible to cultural transmission, and only one troop in a set of many interacting would start, waging war against the others. They would have to defend and blah, blah.
Well, your point is well taken. I mean, this is why we have to think about modern humans like us, where we seem to be able to hold control over our instincts with our frontal lobes. But the clinical experimental evidence shows that we can shift the balance a little bit to what we thought were our reaction norms. So in the testosterone experiment done by Paul Zak, he explained how this two-person interaction game was going to work. And it involved reciprocal giving back parts of a reward that one of them obtained. It was an experiment in degree of generosity and sharing. And the one, it's called the ultimatum game. I don't like that term. You have two people sitting opposite each other. One is given a free $10, and he has the option of keeping it all, giving some proportion or even all of it to the person on the other side of the table, and they have the option to refuse. And there are rewards set by the experimental situation, experimenters for giving. So if you give half of it, both and the recipient accepts the 50%, which they would usually do, then both get a reward. And then the recipient has the option of even giving some back. And then they get an additional reward because they've reinforced their cooperation. You can set the reward structure for what you like. So in the beginning of the experiment, they explained just exactly what they were going to do. And then they asked the recipient of the, after the winner, so to speak, the under and the first recipient said, what would you take as a minimum offer? And the average was 30%. And then they gave them the testosterone. And then when they were offered 30%, they got very upset and refused. And then they got spiteful when it was their turn to be first. But they had consciously said before the experiment that 30% was their cutoff, and they would accept it. But then you give them the testosterone and they don't. So maybe it's what they had for breakfast, if the microbiome has anything to do with it. But whatever is stimulating the testosterone, it does shift the balance in a way. And the same thing happened with the oxytocin. People became more generous and more forgiving of stingy offers. And these two-person games are designed to reveal our nature and our tolerance, and they're quite widely played. They're useful. One version is called The Prisoner's Dilemma. There's a whole book about it. It's an interaction between our biology and what we learn. Now, the most interesting part of this biology that I discovered, it was discovered accidentally. You've heard of the placebo effect. How many of you heard of the nocebo effect? Yes. It's the opposite. You go into a clinical trial, the clinicians say this is the expected beneficial outcomes of the drug that we're testing, and these are the side effects. Some people, especially when the clinician is warm and encouraging and using the kind of language that Steven Pinker has written about that engenders trust. The placebo effect becomes strong in Mendelian proportions.
Mm-hmm.
There are those who are not affected by the placebo, but others react strongly in a positive way to the placebo. And during the course of a study that was on irritable bowel disease, they found that the placebo exhibited the bad effects, the nocebo effects, on an equal number of the individuals in the trial. And so that's how the nocebo effect was discovered, unintentionally, because they were actually just looking at this. Now, it turns out that the genes that are predict the gene that predicts this is called, it's got a long name, it's just called COMT, called catechol methyltransferase. And Arthur C. Clarke did his PhD on the molecule. Very interesting. But there are two versions of the gene. If you have two copies of one version of the gene, you have a very strong placebo effect reaction. If you have two copies of the other version of the gene, then you have a strong nocebo effect. If you have one of each version of this gene, you have no placebo or nocebo effect. Now, I learned about this just a week too late to get into the final draft of a paper that I was asked to co-author on the evolution of propaganda. So I think those that are susceptible to the placebo effect are also susceptible to propaganda. Those who are the opposite gene combination are likely to be those who would have the strong nocebo effect. And they're, you could say, hardwired skeptics, dissidents, never going to trust authority. I'd like to see what the COMT gene is part of the serotonin reuptake and inhibition system, which is why it was being studied in the irritable bowels syndrome study, because the subjects were saying, well, it's all in your head, just stop obsessing and you won't have such bad intestinal problems. And, especially with women, they were thinking the women were crazy. So the COMT gene is often associated with bipolar and schizophrenia-related things. And so it was being tested as just part of the panel. But the real objective was to study the intestinal malady, not the head. And it just emerged. So that's a pretty cool thing. We're not looking for something and find something that has such a fundamental setting consequences. And that's where the nocebo effect was born in about 2014.
Are you familiar with the work of Guy? His surname is Fessler, and he was doing a lot of things about negatively biased credulity. That people, and some people especially, pay extreme attention to the negative side of the information that they receive. Mm-hmm. So there might be some genes that influence whether you will be influenced by what you think, mm-hmm. and this gene can modulate this by whether you are paying rather the attention towards the positive views, or whether your credulity is negatively biased and you believe the side effects, but you are not so much, moved to believe that it may actually help you. So
let's get a snippet of DNA from them.
Yeah.
And see what shows up. And it's a single base pair difference. The 157th codon in the COMT gene. Yes.
Yeah, I might ask a very obvious question, but I would like to ask you whether and if you see any correlation between the resource availability and the ability to use them and the occurrence or frequency of violence in societies, and how it materialized probably also in the social structure and cultural perception. Because my experience is coming mostly from the later stages of the history, mm-hmm. but we are taught, to see and work on this correlation. Of course, it's not that much easy being it the environmental change, the population pressure, change of the social structure, the technological development. And in relation to that, we very much see where there is such a pressure and the potential increase in the interpersonal, intergroup violence, we can see very effective and very rapid technological development. While in those periods of peace or calm, they still use the weapons, but they start to decorate them. And the technological quality decreases, and this notion of people who are savvy or knowledge in fights, for example, they still use it as symbols, but they no longer use their weapons. And those weapons are very shitty in performance, but very nice in appearance.
That's a very interesting point. I think it relates to where I had my theoretical perspective for most of my career. Asking questions about ecology rather than social organization, or social organization emerging from the ecological relationships for food security. And the best strategies are sometimes for your food security to be cooperative with everybody around you, share information so nobody starves. Ben Franklin said we should all hang together, because we will certainly all hang separately in the founding of the United States. The mechanisms of cooperation and trust and lack of warfare that emerge from these macro-local systems and neo-local are turning the equation around. Which came first? And how these different kinds of marriage patterns have emerged, that's, I suppose, another question that only beginning to even ask. If does the ecology come first, or does the social organization come first? And it's not exactly a chicken or egg question, because these are quite different dimensions. As an ecologist, I would like to figure out how the ecology determines it, but I have to step back and say, well, that's my a priori assumption, but my a prioris have failed me many times in my career, and I'm very happy when I see my assumption blown up by good evidence. So that's a really interesting point. I work mostly with hunter-gatherers because the social relationships get so complicated. We call them the tribal level of organization, simple farmers, but they often behave more like troops, strongly defended territories. They dig 3-meter deep trenches around their villages and cut down all the trees and make solid walls of vertical posts. And the outsides, the trenches are filled with projectile points that were shot by the not so friendly neighbors between villages. They're the tribal level, but they're acting like troops. So for me, the evolution of cooperation, however it happens, is still the enduring theme. And starting with this death on the Nile, I've really reoriented my perspective and opened up the box of my box of assumptions, and now taking them out and looking at them in a way I would not have before. So I really have to thank Linka and Nada for destroying my.
We did not intend to do that.
I didn't intend to be thinking about these things in this way when we started this, but this death on the Nile really interfaced with the paleoanthropology that I was brought up with. In graduate school, I had mentors, 4 who were particularly interested in the early stages of human evolution, all the way through, whether it's the archaeological side or the biological anthropology side. I was very fortunate to have these very thoughtful experienced scholars to learn from. And so I'm still learning.
Yeah, Stan, so you say that you are at the end of your career, you are changing your perspective from ecological to more social factors. But you know, this is it's for the centuries of the humanity scholarship that all these things are taken together. The only thing is that different paradigms, different traditions, scholarship traditions, try to put emphasize some aspects again others. Still, so my question is, so there are several post-marital residence options, and this is a social factor, true. But is there any correlation, statistical correlation of the various alternatives of post-marital residence with the distribution of resources in time and space?
Well,
so that because then we should have again the look back to the resources and to the ecology.
So those two papers that I showed, the one by Kang and I think it's Kim Hill and that group with Polly Wiesner, I'm not sure if they actually revisited the ecology to see just, but that the ethnic groups that were in the unique of their studies can be looked up and just see what their ecological correlates are. That's an excellent, question, and it's framed in a way that you can go and look for the right answer. And until you ask the questions the right way, makes you go back and look at the other aspects of the evidence that are not seen. So they're thinking about this, but both of those papers did not assess the ecological factors. But
because I can imagine that this residential system or post-marital residential system can be closely connected to the exploitation of resources and ensuring that there will be enough for the reproduction of the group. So, for example, Jebel Sahaba people who might have been, according to your thesis, might have been patrilocal, let's say, and the patriarchality among these groups might somehow be connected with the, let's say, a lack of resources or only seasonal abundance of resources along the Nile. Because we still don't know where the people who are buried in Jebel Sahaba were living. There's no settlement. And
we do know settlements with the artifacts of those styles, but we don't know the people buried there were the ones who made those artifacts.
And they might have been, and one of the options is that they were seasonally living away from the Nile in what might have been savanna, dry savanna, let's say, during the wet season, and only during the dry season coming closer to the Nile, and then it must have done any group living in the area. So maybe it was a seasonal conflict. There might be opportunity for seasonal conflict during the dry season along the Nile, let's say. Whereas in the early Holocene, when the climate became more stable, more predictable, imagine that
we have any questions?
You can put more investment into the intergroup relations, making more larger nets, social nets, risk mitigating nets.
Yeah, but when I make China, it's like the basic question if they were more interested in the mutation in their post-marital residences or dispersion or mobility, and it has to be probably with the spatial distribution of vital resources. And of course, during the dry periods, water is one of them. And there means a competition of these resources that probably starts the structure of negotiating either violent or peaceful interactions. And I think that's something that
what you are articulating is my perspective for most of my career. And now I'm asking the question, if the resource distributions in the Jebel Sahaba period were not dissimilar from those during the post-1,000-year dry phase, the younger Dryas it's called. If the ecological settings are so similar, what is different? Could it be the subsistence technology? Because, well, we don't know what those Jebel Sahaba people were doing because all we have is the cemetery. And we don't know, again, for Wadi Halfa, where there's almost the same level of violence. There may be the same level of violence. We'll see what Isabel's analysis shows. Could it be the technology? Because they had a lot of grindstones. We see teeth worn down to stumps from gritty foods. They were doing something that just by the teeth alone tells us it was a different diet, which would mean a different mode of resource extraction. So we could fit it into the ecology, subsistence, technology sphere, but we should evaluate the alternative of given the high frequency of what was thought to be the ancestral, the antithesis to the ancestral, exclusively patrilocal ancestral conditions. That assumption has gone out the window. 33 societies studied the predominant post-marital resident of neolocal, matrilocal connected to warfare. So these are open questions. We have to be open to both sides in a way that I wouldn't have been even a year ago. I've been brought up in the same paradigm as you. I was in college as an undergraduate at the time when Lou Binford and David L. Clark and their models, and it took me decades to realize that Lou Binford's favorite word was correlation, not causation. Simply correlation, graph after graph. Yes.
You said it before that it's not the chicken and egg problem, but it is basically still quite similar because it's the feedback loop problem, right? Like it doesn't really matter from which direction you start to change the series of cultural co-adaptation, and it can take you on a large detour from the original set of strategies that were prevalent.
Yeah.
But the big changes in ecology can serve as big switches in these like feedback loop systems that will eventually create the big cultural phenotypes that we see in the graveyards, right?
Yeah.
May I just add? I would put it even in a bit different way. To step aside and just ask if because there is obviously no determinism in these things. It can be both adaptation, both systems, neo-matriarchal or patriarchal, can evolve as a reaction to the same change that happens to the society for some reason. So I think that we should ask for the distribution of such adaptations, but not to just be fixed to the deterministic way of thinking. Or
I agree entirely.
Yeah, it's the question of variation.
Yeah.
Follow the variation, not one simple.
Let's step back just a few cases to the not as broad as the Australopithecines millions of years ago, but what we could call a sister lineage for comparison, the Neanderthals. We can see the archaeological record and to some extent the genetic correlates of open long-distance networks in the last ice age. Now, the earlier, the part of the last ice age when we see the Upper Paleolithic, which the Aurignacian, the Pavlovian, which is on exhibit here at the museum, they clearly had very extensive social networks by the genes and by the distances that the materials in the archaeological sites had come from. Neanderthals lived in the same ecology. They were inbred. They had very few pieces of materials. Their stone tool sources were mostly within 10 to 15 kilometers, and only a few percent came from more than 40 kilometers. 40 kilometers is an important Rubicon because the average size of the diameter of a hunter-gatherer territory, or the radius of a hunter-gatherer group in a semi-desert environment like Australia or the Southern African. Australia is great because there were never any farming to displace the hunter-gatherers. In only the driest environments, they have territories that big. And you go to the northern coast of Australia, Queensland, the rainforest, they have quite a lot of warfare. And the territories are very small. Intergroup warfare is quite common there. So you can see the ecological transition of social and territorial organization. I don't know about the marriage patterns in this case, but the data are undoubtedly there when the ethnographers, we can go back to it. If the ethnographers didn't just assume that the primeval condition was patrolocality, if they didn't just assume, like the assumptions that I often make and don't even check. I've learned over my career, I think this is the way it is, should have been, and then I say that's the way it was. I've learned to, my first impulse is to say that's the way it is, and then I have to turn that is, just turn those two words around, change the syntax to a question, is that the way it was? Just that simple syntactic rearrangement. It's changes your perspective entirely. So when I'm lecturing about the evolution of language, I'll give a very simple example. I can say, I cook dinner for my children, and so I'm a good father. If I say, I cook my children for dinner, the syntax is only slightly, I've rearranged a couple of words, but the meaning is completely the opposite. So the first step to becoming open to alternatives is to turn your assumptions into questions.
Stanley, so for me, what was very most important when we were writing the paper together is this perspective of the post-marital residence. And then, obviously, archaeologists start to ask, how can we address this when we investigate in the field? So there are only few options, and you have worked on one quite new method.
Yes. So when I'm doing isotope geochemistry that allows you to see the geological marker of where the human skeleton was formed. But more important than that, is it more important? What was the whole idea of post-marital residence patterns in archaeology and biological anthropology goes quite far back. Maybe we can just shut off the sound.
Yeah. I will do it.
At the two of my colleagues in my department did their PhD theses on looking at skeletal markers like the extra cusps on teeth and other what are called discrete non-metric characteristics to reconstruct post-marital residence. And I only found this out last fall, a year ago, during the course of trying to reorientate myself around thinking about something other than ecology. And so they're now cited in the paper. Susan Frankenberg and Lyle Koenigsberg, who were students of Jane Dykstra. The first geochemical approaches to reconstructing post-marital residence patterns were, well, they was explicitly to use the geological markers that would tell you where you were born, and to use what's called strontium isotope analysis to reconstruct post-marital residence patterns. Jonathan Erickson in the early 1980s, working with the geochemist who was investigating lead pollution around the world. The third, what is the third way of getting at post-marital residence?
It's the very, there was just based on the osteological examination, the variation among the female and male.
Yes.
Yes,
The demorphism.
The differences in variants. So where the females are more closely related in the cemetery, that would be
matrilocal,
post-marital, matrilocal post-marital. Yeah. The third way is the DNA itself, if you have it. And the studies that combine the DNA and the isotope geochemistry are really compelling. And I could actually show a little bit of this data, but that would be better to have a whole other talk about the way this could all be tested. But when you use all the techniques together, it really reinforces sometimes. So there's a study of the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age in southern Germany. 900-year duration cemetery. All of the females that are buried in high status graves come from someplace by the geological marker that's close by here, maybe Moravia. None of their genetic daughters are present in the cemeteries where the matriarchs, if we call them, are buried. The high status males are genetically related. And 3 of the individuals look like they were sent away as teenagers when their last kids was forming. The third molar formed when you're a teenager somewhere else, but then they came back home. The prodigal son, because they were buried in the context that matched the geochemistry of where they were nursed, and which they know what the geochemistry is, where they were buried. So the low status females, who may have been classed as household servants for centuries, are buried in simple graves, and they're not related to the females in the high status graves. But the high status females have no daughters. They were obviously being shipped away. In all of these manor, they were big households. You could call them manors with complex extended families and servants or slaves. None of those daughters are there. It's a huge study. It was published in 2019, 2018. Most important study, the combined archaeological, genetic, and geochemical evidence. And it really is important. And the way it's all interpreted is really great. I should show you, I have a lot of fun with this. I should just show you what it looks like. As it was portrayed in science. Can I just do this? Yes, do this. That didn't scale very well.
Stop share the red button on the.
Do I have to stop share?
Okay, stop share.
Do we have anybody?
No problem. So you can just use the Google Chrome icon down there, and it's. You want to go to the internet, right?
No, I want to go back to my USB.
Ah, to your USB. So there will be some noises again. You can put it in. No noises. I have toned it down, but not completely, so you could hear that there was.
This has more to do with imagination, in interpretation of the same things. Werner Herzog the filmmaker said, facts do not constitute truth. We can make very different interpretations depending upon our theory of the same facts. And I tell this to my theory students. Can I just open this?
The first line.
Nabi?
No, this one.
Okay. So we're doing a lot of ostrogexual work, both in Sudan, in Malawi, and what I want to show is this amazing study of the I'm not a tapper.
You're upside down.
Almost impossible,
But you can try
yes.
pressing F5.
Get through these ostrogexuals. Oh, where did it put this? Beginning. This is the German study, which is so fundamental. On the back. So, one of the unifying things in anthropology is the concept of life history, human biographies, the biographies of the artifacts, the dents that accumulate on your computer, the life history of a tool as it's worn down and resharpened and repurposed. Things that we can say geologically it came from here, that's its provenience. Archaeologically, if we recovered it as an archaeologist there, that's its provenience as well. Everything in between is a story we make up about how it got from the geological to the archaeological context. And that's what we call provenance. Now, many archaeologists use provenance indiscriminately when they actually mean provenience. But the art historians know what provenance is, the chain of custody of an artwork. And so those are conceptually very different. And we've written a couple of papers where we emphasize the discussions that have been going on about that. And we have life histories. So this is the paper, Kinship-Based Social Inequality in Bronze Age. This is the journal Science. They call they put a classification on it called Ancient Sociology. And it's about DNA and geochemistry and archaeology altogether to make social anthropology. Bronze Age inequality in family life revealed in a powerful study, and it is a powerful study. But what I want to show you is the in the journal Nature that was published in Science, but the review of this in Nature, they showed the skeleton of a high-class female and one of the artifacts associated with it. And it says, isotopic analysis revealed that this woman found near Klein-Neitingen, Germany, grew up in a distant land. The science writer, reporter for paleoanthropology, Ann Gibbons, likes to write about DNA studies a lot. And so the image accompanying her story of summary of this new research showed the what we've just seen with the high status burial is a lone young lady wearing sackcloth, and she's walking the last few kilometers to her new village alone, and her family is just one last look as they disappear over the hillside. This is provenance. Archaeologists have their imaginations, and others have their imaginations. The anthropologists, Gary Feynman and Joan Neitzel, this is only one half of the diorama that was a 2-page wide spread And we can see the woman on the horse wearing golden robes. The horse has also got gold braids, and she's looking incredibly flattered. We're trying not to look incredibly flattered, and everybody's celebrating the arrival of the new matriarch. How different a story can you make based on the same set of facts? So, Stephen Jay Gould used to say, we're storytellers, we should tell better stories. We can make many stories from the same facts. So the three young men who spent their teenage years elsewhere, did they go to their father's side of the family? Did they go to their mother's side of the family? Or did they just run away? What did they do? That story has not been put into paint the way this one has. But how different can you get? Lone young lady versus the heralding, the banners, and flags, and everybody celebrating this. So provenience. I just found a paper was published in 2022 in an Italian journal about the history of representations of Neanderthals among Italian paleoanthropologists and the artists who worked with them. And of course, Burian here, he's got his own creations. Now, there's one Burian thing that I was going to mention to you. This is the old robust man painting the Venus.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you're interested in different representations of this, April Nowell, Nowell, has a TED Talk about these Venus figurines and the predominantly male interpretation of them as sex objects for the men, made by the men. She said, well, what about the women? And you just have to watch this. It's just an incredible turning the mirror around, turning the perspective around. As I thought about this, I showed this to my class to show how we can make very different interpretations. It's all of the reporting on the find from the Arid nation, I think it is, the Venus in southern Germany, that Paul Mellars called pornography. All the reporting was being done by male reporters. Time Magazine, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, it was all from the male perspective. But then I started thinking, my children, my boys, would never touch a Barbie doll. No matter how attractive Donald Trump thinks the Barbie doll physique is. The girls, I've watched my granddaughter and her cousins, the Christmas time, they unwrap the Barbie dolls and they all go off and groom the hair and everything. What are the boys doing? Not interested. So that's a change in perspective. It's really terrific. I recommend you see watch the YouTube, the TED Talk by April Nowell on this. She's got others on raising children in Paleolithic. She has a book called Bringing Up. And it just shows you how different the perspectives can be on the same evidence. Werner Herzog, when he said facts do not constitute truth, we have the fact of the Willendorf Venuses. They are a fact. The interpretation from the male perspective and female perspective is completely different. One set of facts, 180-degree interpretation, just like almost anything else. if you can pull yourself back from the paradigm.
What's it? I just wanted to remark that this is interesting perspective because the Willendorf Venus, they have like very elaborated hair, whereas the Dolní Věstonice Venus does not, right? Like it's completely hairless.
But you don't know what might have been on her head.
It can be exactly. It can be something else that and only the ceramics was preserved. So this is
Olga Sofer.
the Barbidol hypothesis is great.
Olga Sofer, who came worked at the Milovica here. She in the latter part of her career emphasized the woven, the clothing of the Upper Paleolithic women, especially the hats. In fact, so some of the Venuses actually have the hats, and she went into this in great detail. She was replicating her own pre-archaeology career, where she was a fashion buyer for Macy's department store back when Macy's was really powerful. It still is. Every year she would go to the fashion shows in London and Milan and Paris, buy the latest fashions. And she also went through a household decor decoration phase. And so we have the mammoth bone houses. The clothing was after that. She started at a simpler level, so to speak, with food storage, because many of these mammoth bone houses have what look like food storage bins. And then she got into replicating her career. And then she retired, and her new career is raising grandchildren.
Great. I think, yeah, you're coming to this end of this event, so it's the time is almost over. So I think the message we got, we came to the last about the storytelling, about the different perspectives. I think it would be a really great take-home message from today, let's say. So yeah. So if so we can discuss further if you join us for lunch. Yeah, it'd be great. So we can discuss.
I may have worked up an appetite, so I could just pull this out.
Yeah. So thank you.
You can